To bend or not to bend, to play clean or dirty. These are some of the questions that pop into the minds of many 21st century guitarists who get into jazz. And in order to explore the answers, in this video, I want to talk about the evolution of jazz guitar. I also want to talk about the conservatives or purists versus the liberals of the jazz guitar world and discuss the pros and cons of each side. I'm Richie Zellen, and I want to welcome you back to the Jazz Guitar channel. And if this is your first time and you want to learn everything you can about jazz guitar, please consider subscribing and be sure to click the bell icon so you won't miss anything. When I first got into guitar as a kid, I spent my first 10 years playing nothing but rock and blues and using distortion and overdrive while bending strings like crazy. And then I discovered jazz and everything changed. After going out and purchasing my first archtop, my solid body ended up gathering dust in the closet for the next 10 years. And so I forgot all about bending strings, and the thought of playing my ES-175 with even a touch of overdrive became disgusting. What happened? Well, in all honesty, I went from being a liberal rock guitarist to a snobby, ultra-conservative jazz guitarist. You see, back in those days, liberal jazz guitarists were simply non-existent. You either played an archtop with a clean sound and no bending of strings, or you did not fit into the accepted definition of jazz guitarists. These were the late 60s or early 70s, and John McLoughlin had just recorded with Miles Davis on Bitches Brew. And along with Larry Coryell, I remember them being among the first guitarists to break away from the established definition of jazz guitarist. These guys had the guts to play solid bodies, introduce string bends, and even use distortion. And you know what? They were not liked by the jazz guitar conservatives. The thing is that within the next 2 decades, the jazz scene was invaded by a growing number of guitarists who played solid bodies employing string bends and effects. And they were labeled jazz fusion guitarists. Funny, lots of them could be using bebop or post-bop vocabulary in their solos, but as long as they played a solid body with effects, the jazz community referred to them as fusion guitarists. So let's fast forward to the present. Today, the jazz scene is full of guitarists who play solid bodies and occasionally use string bends and effects. And as long as their improvisational vocabulary is recognizable as being bebop or post-bop rooted, they are simply regarded as jazz guitarists. So as a result, today we have what I like to refer to as the 3 jazz guitarist tendencies: conservative, liberal, and, for lack of a better term, bipartisan. Exchange these labels for whatever you like, but I choose to use them because they bring to mind several stereotypical attitudes in today's political reality, and it so happens that they serve as the ideal metaphor for what has transpired in the world of jazz guitar throughout its evolution. So let's have some fun with this. Now, you're probably wondering where I stand regarding these 3 tendencies. Well, before I actually tell you, let me describe the pros and cons of each one. And also, if you haven't figured out where you stand, this might shed some light. First, we have the conservative jazz guitarists. They are sometimes labeled purists. These are the cats who stick to the roots and carry the traditional jazz guitar torch. I believe they deserve our utmost respect because they not only defined what jazz guitar is, but actually pioneered it. So think Charlie Christian, Wes Montgomery, Barney Kessel, Joe Pass, and even someone like Django Reinhardt and the rest of the gypsy jazz players. In other words, for conservative, you want to think bebop on a clean arch top, bebop or swing, and an acoustic tendency. And instead of talking about the pros of being a conservative player, let me grab my arch top and demonstrate. I believe a good arch top speaks for itself. This is the most organic expression of jazz guitar. That natural woody tone. There's nothing like it. And the beautiful craftsmanship. This is totally made by hand. Now, in terms of cons, as far as the arch top goes, it can be very difficult to play in certain live environments because of the feedback you get when amplified. But the main con I want to point out is regarding the attitude a majority of arch top players have towards the liberal or solid body jazz players. Some of them forgot that in their heyday, the founding fathers of jazz guitar might have been considered liberals. Take Charlie Christian, for instance. He was among the first to play an electric guitar in a jazz setting, and this was yet not widely accepted, nor was a guitarist as an improviser among pianists and horn players. I also should add, by the way, that those early tube amps like Charlie Christian used produced a lot of overdrive when cranked up. And several decades later, no conservative jazz guitarist in his right mind would dare call that a clean or jazz sound. Now, I believe this bad attitude towards some of the younger non-purists is due to their overzealousness in wanting to preserve the tradition started by those who put the guitar on the jazz map. I remember reading about Barney Kessel in one of the jazz magazines after they did one of those blindfold tests where he would have to identify and comment on a given recording. Well, they played a recent Jim Hall recording at the time, and Barney just went on to blast him. He criticized his tone and said he used lighter gauge strings as if it were sacrilege. He also criticized the music and the players with him, implying that they had no personality. And to top it off, I remember Jim Hall was starting to incorporate some effects pedals in his playing at the time. But in conclusion, Barney's attitude was very typical of many conservative jazz guitarists who have had a problem in accepting that all music evolves, especially when played on an instrument such as the guitar, which is still evolving. We could actually apply this whole discussion to jazz keyboard players, and you'll find an exact parallel. The keyboard conservatives just hated Herbie Hancock, for example, when he switched over from acoustic piano to electric keyboards in the early 70s. So I'm sure you get the picture. But having said that, conservative attitudes are not half as bad as they used to be. And that is partly because the original generations of conservative jazz guitarists are almost gone, and the ratio of purists against liberals has largely diminished. In conclusion, many purists fear that the term jazz guitar might be undergoing something along the lines of what has happened with the term jazz over the last 30 years or so. It used to be that you mentioned you were a jazz musician to the average person, and they might reply something like, "Oh yes, I've heard of Miles Davis, but I don't really understand that music." Well, today you mention you're a jazz musician, and half of them comment, "Oh, I just love Kenny G." You can imagine how this drives sax players berserk. Okay, let's talk about the so-called liberal jazz guitarists. I want you to think John Scofield, Mike Stern, Pat Metheny, John Abercrombie. I want you to think solid bodies and semi-hollows and occasional string bending and liberal use of effects. Most of us living today started playing guitar in the world of classic rock or some stage of its evolution up to the present. I don't personally know today any jazz guitarist who didn't get into jazz after first being a rock or blues player. So, the solid body as an initial instrument has been a natural choice. And as a result, it is often the case today that those who discover jazz make a gradual transition to it by learning first on their solid body before even thinking of acquiring an archtop. Now, some just keep playing their solid body even after they become proficient jazz players. So, what are the pros of a jazz guitarist who plays a solid body? I love to play on a solid body, especially a Fender Strat or Tele, because even though it doesn't have the classic jazz sound, it does have a sound that can be very jazzy. You know, it's got that very pleasant, chimey tone that cuts through beautifully in the mix. That's why you have cats like Ed Bickert who play a Tele. He played a Tele all of his life. And the other thing is, because we can use lighter gauge strings, there's something about bending that can make a note sing. For example, the only con I want to mention regarding liberal jazz guitarists lies in the bad attitude department. I have had younger students that can only relate to the guitarists of their generation and initially have a lack of respect for the older, more traditional players who put the jazz guitar on the map. And this is somewhat normal to a certain extent because we all have a tendency to be exposed to and initially influenced by the players of our generation. However, if we really want to understand how they develop their style, we must understand and learn to appreciate those that came before them and influenced them. If you understand the elements of those that influenced them, you'll hear that in the midst of all the modern nuances that attracted you to their playing, there is a common foundation. And I'm talking about bebop. There is no jazz as we know it today without some degree of an underlying bebop foundation. If you listen to what I've defined as the cats who brought about liberal or non-purist jazz guitar, you'll hear some degree of bebop. Listen to Schofield, Stern, Metheny, or Abercrombie, for example, and you'll hear some bebop in there. Even someone like John McLoughlin, when he plays straight ahead, has bebop elements in his playing. And if you can't hear it, that's because you don't really understand the foundation. So that's why it's necessary to study and analyze the music of the older, more conservative generations of jazz guitarists. Otherwise, your phrases might lack some defining jazz elements. But worst of all, you in turn will end up as much of a snob as the conservatives who do not respect or accept the evolution of jazz guitar. Like many guitarists of the day, I would categorize myself as being bipartisan, or if we stick with the political metaphors, I think I would probably use the term progressive. I would label one of my all-time jazz guitar heroes as a progressive. And of course, I'm referring to Jim Hall. He redefined the meaning of jazz guitar while keeping one foot firmly in the established tradition, yet at the same time incorporating new concepts. He inspired and collaborated with many newer generations of guitarists and helped many of them who were breaking out of that traditional mold gain wider recognition and acceptance. So, in a way, I believe Jim Hall is to the world of jazz guitar what Miles is to jazz in general. Now, personally, I'm just at home with a Strat as I am with an ES-175. It just depends on what I want to play, what I want to express. So that's where I stand. Now, how about you? Do you consider yourself a conservative, liberal, or progressive jazz guitarist? I would love to hear your comments, and that way we can all maybe get a better picture of what the major tendency is these days out there. That will also help me better decide on what topics to cover in future videos. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. And be sure to click on the bell icon so you won't miss anything. Have fun, and see you in the next video.